I'd like to welcome everybody to the first lesson for the study of Book of Daniel. We're going to take a little bit different approach on the first lesson. And the reason for it is there's so much rich background in history and setting things in perspective of when Daniel was written. It is also a very contested book in the Bible. We'll talk about that as well. But it's such an important book in the Old Testament. There's many commentators that has said that this is probably the most important book in the Old Testament. It is the last of the major prophets, and there's arguments there as well, whether it's really a prophecy or a book of prophecy. There's no question it is, but there's arguments there. So we want to get into these backgrounds, getting into a little history lesson, quite honestly. It's pretty amazing. And the reason for that is to substantiate everything that is happening in Daniel so that we've got a clear background. Because we know that if you're discussing this with some people are skeptics, are going to find a reason to say, oh, no, that book's not, no, that's not real. And it is in every shape, fashion, and form. We had a couple of commentators said this is the very book that took away all questions about whether the Bible has error in it or not, or whether or not God really wrote the whole Bible. And actually, this is a book that they hang their salvation on, believe it or not. I'm not saying I would go that far, but that's just how important of a book this is. It's been on our heart for a while. We've taken little dives in it and out of it, particularly as we went through the book of Revelation, but it pops up in other places as well. And so we're gonna mention that as we get through these 12 chapters. We don't know how long it's going to take. It doesn't matter. We're going to take a little slow, go one at a time and see where we go. So the next is just an overview of the book itself. If we look at the book, it's actually 6 chapters. The first six chapters, for 12 chapters, the first 6 chapters of the 12 is really historical in nature. And then when we get in 7 through 12, it's really prophecy. It's all prophecy. And so the thing that one commentator brought out is that it's not necessarily chronological. So don't think that all the things happen chronologically. And that's one thing in the Bible we get hung up on. We see chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and we think in the terms of a timeline. We think, 1 is first, 2 is second, and that's not necessarily the case. That was pointed out by one of the commentators, is that it really isn't chronological. I'm not going to go put it in the order that they put it in. We don't have time to go through that tonight. But just to recognize the fact that it is not, and I do believe it's not chronological, because you can't look at it in that basis. The other thing is fairly unique is that actually chapters 1 through 6 is written in Arabic, and 7 through 12 is Hebrew. And we're going to get into this translation issue here as we get into the study tonight. The other thing that's pretty unusual about the book is that it's written by more than one person. I'm not arguing, was it Daniel or not? I believe it was, even though a lot of people say it wasn't. But the fact is, if it wasn't, it wouldn't make any difference anyway, because the verification of the prophecy is already there. But it is written by 2 people, and that's rarely brought up. And so we'll hit on that too as we go through here. So if we look at the first 6 chapters, the first one is basically the invasion of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the deported of the teenagers, the deportation of the teenagers, however you want to put it. It should be teenagers, not teenagers. But anyway, it's the second one is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. The second one is the bow and the burn, the furnace. You've heard of some of these before. And then Nebuchadnezzar's pride. I think he wrote that chapter, quite honestly. We'll get to that. The fall of Babylon, the lion's den, and then we get into the 4 beasts. We get in the ram and the he-goat, and then the most amazing prophecy in the whole Bible is contained in chapter 9 in the 70 weeks of Daniel. Those that have been with us a while know that we've gotten into these 70 weeks in several different studies. And this is where it's all laid out. We will get into the detail of the 70 weeks of Daniel. And we're living in that time frame right now. We're in actually the period between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel. In chapter 10, which I'm not real familiar with, but he classified it as spiritual warfare. It's the dark side. It's what's happening spiritually is chapter 10. Chapter 11 is really the silent years. It's the 400 years from the last Old Testament book to Christ's birth and really John the Baptist. So it's that 400 years that are called the silent years. That's when the Maccabees went to war. You have the Maccabees. Those books are included in the Roman Catholic Bible. They're not included in the Protestant Bible. That's that period that he explains. And he really gets into the detail here in such preciseness. That's where a lot of the argument comes out of this there. And then the last one is the consummation of end times. It's Revelation. That's what it is. It's the book of Revelation. It's the consummation of end times. And so you see where he spans this whole time. So what we're going to do is while we get into this, is Annette's going to give you a little bit of history about Israel, about Judea, about what's happening, the time period, the empires that are there, the leaders, because all of this is buried within Daniel.
So we thought it would be helpful to go into a little bit of history, and I've got some of my stuff cut off here. Let me see if I can do this, and that'll help me. So just to give you some background and history on where all this came from, what the events of Daniel even occurring. Let's go back and we look at the 12 tribes of Israel. We know that you had when they inherited the land and things were going on, and I'm not going to get into precise history, this could be a whole college course over the course of a semester, but they were divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so we had Reuben, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Manasseh, and Ephraim that settled in the northern region. And then all of the kings that came from the northern region were evil and led the people into idolatry. And Assyria, God handed them over to Assyria. Assyria, I think that the capital is Nineveh, right?
Yeah.
The capital is Nineveh. And so, which is funny because Jonah, we know the story about Jonah, and Jonah wanted these people wiped out, and then God saved them and then used them to school the northern kingdom. But they were captured by Assyria, and Assyria was an enemy of Egypt. So that's just important to know. Then we had the southern kingdom with Judah and Benjamin. They returned to God. They had a series of kings. Some of them there were 3 good ones, 11 wicked ones. So the wicked ones were interspersed among the kings, and they kept taking the people back into idolatry, back into the high places and things. And then a good king would come in and he would wipe it out and bring the people back to the Lord. But they did return. They were primarily more in line with God than the northern kingdom. A lot of times people will call the northern kingdom the lost kingdom, that these tribes are lost tribes because they were wiped out. It just disappeared under the Assyrian rule. They destroyed everything. They intermarried. That's why Samaria, the Samaritans were called half Jews because they were half Assyrians, half from the tribes of Judah. And so that was a problem. But what we do need to know is that many of the faithful from these tribes migrated down into the southern kingdom. And so they're not the lost tribes. They are integrated into southern kingdom. And probably these 12 tribes still are intact today, based on this migration. The one other tribe, Levi was the priestly line, and Moses and Aaron came from that line, but the tribe of Levi was dispersed among all the nations, so of course they made it. through.
One of the interesting things that's here, that when we started looking at this, we think of Israel and we think of Jerusalem as being part of Israel, and it's not. And what happens is Jerusalem is actually part of Judea, and Samaria is part of Israel. And that, I didn't even think about that, because I always thought Jerusalem and Israel were synonyms. You know, one was the country, one was the capital of the country, but it really wasn't. When they divided, Jerusalem went with Judea. And as history goes, Israel got wiped out, as Annette said, by Assyria. And so Judah became known as Israel and became synonymous with Israel. And so that's where the confusion came from. So I thought that was, pretty interesting to make sure now I have that clear in my head.
So then let's look at Babylon. So I went ahead and I found this map, the Babylonian Empire, but I went ahead and added in modern day countries. So we've got Saudi Arabia down here, Israel is in this area, Iran is over here, Iraq is in the middle, then we've got this is Turkey. And so we see Jerusalem would be over in here, due west of Babylon. And so Babylon was also known as Shinar, that's an ancient term. And they and Egypt over here, they're bitter enemies and always battling and trying to conquer lands. Judah, this is now try. Why are we here? Why did Daniel, the events of the first 7 chapters, or the first chapter anyway of Daniel, why did these deportations occur? So Judah had failed to allow the lands to go through their Sabbath. And what that was that God, just as with a week where we have 6 days of work and 1 week of rest, God mandated that you would have 6 years to work the land with 1 year of rest. For 490 years, which is just amazing how all of this is so precise. For 490 years, the Israelites had gone away from the practice of the Sabbath for the land, and they had not rested the land. And so God permitted Babylon to take them into captivity to reclaim those 70 years. So they were in captivity the amount of time needed to repay the Sabbath, or to account for the Sabbaths that were missed. In addition to allowing the land to rest, it was also a punishment really for idolatry. Their penchant, their craving for idolatry. What we know is that we had 3 periods of captivity, 605, 597, and 586. These were prophesied in Isaiah 39, and Daniel was the first deportation. And when we get into the history, we'll go into what each of these different years entailed and who was involved.
Yeah, and the key thing here, as we're going through this, and we go through the book of Daniel, and you get the dating, because we're going to have people contesting the dating and the impossibilities of this. And what Annette is showing you, this is historical documents. This is not the Bible. This is historical documents that have been recovered through archaeology and been preserved. So these things are fairly they are completely substantiated. So as we get into Daniel and the writing this old, these dates and the things that we're talking about are very, very well established and proven.
So then if we look back in time again, how did Babylon decide to go into Israel? Well, Hezekiah, this is back in Isaiah 39, I believe. Maybe Isaiah 39. Hezekiah is reigning. He did not like Assyria, and he knew Babylon was an enemy of Assyria, and Hezekiah had recovered from an illness. And so the king Nebuchadnezzar had sent a letter to Hezekiah and, showing him well wishes for his recovery. And Hezekiah invited his messengers in and showed him all of his wealth and his military standings and all of the abundance of food they had. And even though he was told he probably shouldn't do that. So then in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, Babylon and Egypt are bitter enemies. Now Jehoiakim has been under the control of Egypt but I mean, the Egypt has conquered Judea, but Jehoiakim is left as a puppet king. They knew he was no threat. He wasn't going to go against them. He wasn't going to rock the boat. So he stayed on the throne, but he answered to uh, to Egypt. So he in 605, Jehoiakim, in the third year of his reign, and there is some things there, and I'm not sure where that comes in. I mean, there is some questions about, they try to say, well, Daniel's in error because it wasn't in the third year of his reign this happened, it was in the fourth year of his reign. But the way that, there's two different ways to look at it. Some of them looked at his reign as happening on the 366th day, that was the first year of his reign. And then the way the Jews looked at it is the first year of the reign started on day one. So those two are not in conflict. It is the same time. It's not a discrepancy. Yeah.
Yeah, and what we found out too in doing additional research is that the Babylonians had a common way of talking about when a king went into office. The first year, they didn't consider that as part of their term. It was basically an inauguration year in which they didn't count that. So they never counted the first year of a king as being the year he went into office. It's a year after that. The Jewish people always considered the first time he took the throne. And so you had that year between the two. Well, Daniel is writing in the perspective of Babylonian customs, and Jeremiah is the one that writes in the perspective of Jews' customs. And Jeremiah is where you find it's in the fourth year of Jehoiakim. And basically Daniel said it was in the third year. And so that little conflict, you have people wanting to say that the book is full of error, and it really isn't. It's completely justifiable the two different ways we said. It's just, so you go back and you do the research and it's there. The Jewish people looked at it one way, the Babylonian people looked at it another way, completely different culture.
So then, if you look at the 597 captivity, Jehoiachin was, I think Jehoiakim's son was in power, and he was wicked. And the interesting thing about him is that this captivity happened in 597, and at this time, God cursed the bloodline. And so it's interesting when you go to Matthew does the bloodline of Christ coming down and ending with Joseph. Am I correct with that? But Luke does it differently, and he comes, and instead of taking, he comes down and takes the second son of, I'm sorry, my mind went blank on the second son. He takes the second son and brings the line down, and brings the line down through Mary. So we know both Mary and Joseph came from the line of David, but Joseph came from Jehoiachin's line. And so by having a virgin birth, which could be a whole other study about the reasoning and the meaning of having a virgin birth, by that whole thing, he eliminates this, he eliminates the cursed bloodline and brings it down, Jesus, through David's line, but also from Mary's line, is how that did. So anyway, that's what happened in the 597. And then Zedekiah came back into rule. I think he was an uncle, and he came back in, and he was also very evil. By this time, Babylon is fed up with Judea and what they're going through and what they're doing. And they said, this is enough. So this is when they come in, they destroy Jerusalem, they get rid of everything. It had been prophesied by Ezekiel that Zedekiah would be exiled to Babylon, but he would never see it, which didn't make much sense. So, but what occurred, I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar wasn't looking at prophecy, but what occurred is that because he was so evil, Nebuchadnezzar brought in all his family and killed them before his eyes. And then, it's horrific, I'm sorry to say, but took a hot sword and burned his eyes out and took him in captivity back blinded. So Ezekiel prophesied all of this very clearly, and it did occur through historical documents, as it said.
Let me try to
Yes.
clarify. One thing, and I mean, we may not have this totally accurate, but Matthew took the heritage from a Jewish standpoint because Matthew was Jewish. Luke took it from a Gentile standpoint. So he took the input, the genealogy from Adam all the way through. And Matthew took it from Abraham to Joseph to David. The difference is that David, I think, Matthew went with Solomon, which was first son, and Luke went with the second son, Nathan, and Mary was of Nathan. And we had one of the commentators said, you know, when he put I think the blood curse was put on that whole family. And God said, no one from this family will ever be in leadership again. And so he said, Satan must have been, you know, gloating. Look at it, I got him. I finally got him. And says God was smiling because she said he doesn't know the whole plan.
No, God, he said, this is funny. I'll say, God said, I could just see God. He said, I could see God up there going to the angels. Hey, watch this one. When he gave him to the line through Nathan. Yeah. Okay. Just kind of, again, to show you how our timeline is. Some people like timelines, and we found this, and I thought it interesting. From Genesis through here, this is all pre-Daniel. The exile is in this period here. So then we have about 400 years between the exile and the coming of Christ. The New Testament time is about in here. We are in this area in here. Waiting for Israel to be restored. And that you've got that in your notes if you want to look at that. But we thought that was an interesting thing.
So one of the issues that come up here, and these are just bullet points to talk about. If anybody has any input, we're not asking this in form of questions right now. We're trying to give you background. But if you have something to add because we missed it or something that we need to look at, let us just please interject that as we go through here.
And it is a lot of history, and so we hope we don't misspeak it. I mean, we don't misspeak it, but if you know differently, please step in.
Yeah, I think Jeremiah's misspelled.
Okay.
Yeah. But we have some misspells here, but spell check didn't catch it, but that's okay. Sometimes automatic spell check gets you in trouble. But anyway, the question on who wrote the book of Daniel, there's one theory that it was written by someone probably in the 1st century before Christ, like 100 BC, because the accuracy of what happened in these 400 silent years that is predicted in here, they're arguing there is no way it was that accurately predicted as according to where it happened. So it had to be written as a historical document, not as a prophetic document. That's impossible. And so the argument was it was written after these things were said. Yet what we're going to run into is if somebody would have wrote it, you know, that's the last thing here. Why would somebody write it and give Daniel credit for it and not ever claim? That would make no sense whatsoever. And so what happens is this, okay, well, Daniel, we know, lived in 600 BC. He wrote it. He himself states he writes it. He makes reference to he's right. He also writes in the third person, which is very normal for somebody to write in that world, to speak in third person. He wasn't called a prophet by the Jews. That's why they put him between the major prophets and the minor prophets when they canonized the Bible. But Jesus himself in Matthew 24:15 calls Daniel the prophet and identifies Daniel in 2 other verses as Daniel being the person who wrote the book of Daniel. So if there's any question, Jesus clarified it, but that's not enough for people. You know, they're going to keep digging. He was also contemporary with Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and they both wrote about him during these time periods. And it's interesting that Jehoiakim was told by Ezekiel and Jeremiah, do not go against the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. This is God's instrument. and it was, and we'll talk about that. He refused to listen to them. They kept warning him. He refused to listen to them. He went against them. He was killed in the second revolt. He was killed. That's when his son came into the middle of that seizure and took over. They warned his son. He ignored them. They threw Jeremiah in jail, and they exported Ezekiel to Babylonia. They got him out of here. There were prophets, didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. They had other prophets all around them saying, you need to go after them. We need to go. We need to defeat Babylon. And they kept warning them, and it's all in scripture. God is going to destroy and wipe out Jerusalem and Israel. Don't go against them. They did anyway, and that's what's happened. So this whole issue about who wrote the book, I think it's clear it's Daniel. I'm not sure it makes any difference when we get into it. We're going to show you why it has to be dated the way it's dated, and why we know it was dated before the silence years were written. And we're going to get into that proof and documentation in just a minute.
One thing I'll just add just to that
Right
section,
now.
I did not know this, and probably everybody knows it but me, but I think it's interesting, so I'll tell you. We said Daniel was placed between the major prophets and the minor prophets. So what did I think? Well, the major prophets were the real important ones, and the minor prophets were a little bit less important, but that's not true. They're called major prophets or minor prophets simply by the length of their books, supposedly. So Daniel happened right in the middle, and there was a lot of discussion. Did he belong there? When they canonized it, where are they going to put him? And they just put him right between the two. So I thought that was. So the validity of the book, it's very, very highly contested, as Dave said, primarily because between the period of 175 and 164 BC is so precisely predicted that they said there's no possible way these events of the destruction of the temple and all that, there's no possible way that this could happen without it being written after the fact. And so they went through a lot of ways of trying to validate it. So one of the ways is the Septuagint. This is something I didn't really know about, but the Septuagint was the king wanted, was the king of Egypt? King of Egypt wanted the Bible translated into Greek because Greek was spoken by everyone. Hebrew was only used occasionally. And he wanted write Greek, but he wanted it to be accurate. So the legend goes, or the story goes, that he got, some say 70, but some say 72 translators in, all completely isolated from each other, not at all alone, gave them the documents and had them translated. And when they brought them together, found that they were pretty much in unity, and that became the Bible that was the Greek Bible and that was used widely for a long time. So the Septuagint had Daniel in it. And the Septuagint happened in
285
BC.
It was completed, so it was started.
Right, it was completed.
It was completed in 270. We get these backwards. BC, you go opposite.
Right.
So it started in 285. It got completed in 270 BC.
But it was predicting things that were happening in 175 and 164. And so just by virtue that it's in the Septuagint documents, proves it was written before 174, because that was in 200, like 100 years before that. Another source is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written, so were dated about 150 to 30 BC, that were found in 1947. Those have been dated. They have found documents of Daniel in there that predated that puts it back to at the time where it should have happened. And then in 332, which is halfway BC, 332 BC, halfway between when Daniel wrote it and when these predictions that occurred so precisely, which make people doubt that it could possibly have been written in advance, there's a priest called Judah who showed, and this is Josephus' historical documents, this is not Bible. So it is substantiated by historic civil documents, but the priest Judah showed Alexander the Great references to Daniel and the names in Daniel and stuff, his name in Daniel, and for that reason, Alexander the Great preserved the city and did not destroy it after all.
Right.
And so these things all go to show that it was written in 600, as it said. Definitely, if it wasn't written 600, it was certainly written before 285 because it was part of the Septuagint. So.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the Septuagint is that Greek was the world language of that region. And even all the Jews spoke Greek fluently. And Hebrew became kind of like Latin is to the Roman Catholics. It was used in services and ceremonies, but all the common people spoke Greek. They were raised speaking Greek. And so I didn't realize that, but that was, even through Egypt, they were speaking Greek. That was common. When these emperors like Alexander the Great and Nebuchadnezzar, when they came in, they used some very strategic plans to integrate these captive nations into their empire. And this is part of what you see is happening to here, Judea or Israel. The other thing's interesting about the Septuagint is the Bible referenced in the New Testament, the whole New Testament. Every reference in the Old New Testament is to the Septuagint translation, not to the Hebrew translation. I don't know whether that's true. That was one commentator said that, but that was the only Bible that was really in great circulation because it was the one that most people could read. The other thing he mentioned is that the Greek language is so much more precise than the Hebrew language. And so this translation with the 70 people coming in concurrence, they didn't compare plans. They produced their own and they're all pretty much identical. But anyway, he was saying that the Greek language is so much more precise, but it was what was used during the New Testament period. It wasn't actually the old Hebrew that was there in the Old Testament. So why is all this important? We're talking about this, and we're talking about the captivity of Jerusalem and all this, is that it really shows who God is. It shows the dedication God has to his people. He says, what do you mean? Well, he warned the Israelites over and over and over. When you go to First Kings and Second Kings and First Chronicles, all these things, you have bad kings, they come into favor. They come out of favor. You have good kings, they go into favor. You can have bad kings, they go out of favor. And he warned and warned and warned them. And when you get Jehoiakim, this is the last of the straws. He's done. That's why he's given the Holy Spirit's words to Ezekiel and Jeremiah to warn these people, I'm done. And so he really cares for Israel, but he's going to live up to what he said he was going to do. And so what happens is we see what's happening is he's actually protecting Israel through the wrath that he's putting on Israel. And you're going to see that coming out. And he's actually going to be comforting the Jews, even though they're going through exile to Babylon. They're being brought into slavery in Babylon. They're not even free people anymore. He's given them some way of giving them really comfort during this period. And that's who Daniel is going to wind up being when it's all said and done.
And in addition to showing God's dedication to the people, Daniel is going to be a very, very good example to us to follow in our dedication to God.
Right.
So this is a good book for us to study and pattern our lives after the dedication of Daniel. It's important to remember that.
Right. And then Daniel contains in the Old Testament the end time prophecies. And we usually think of the Old Testament as prophecies concerning the coming of the Messiah, the first coming. The Old Testament is full of prophecies of the second coming of Christ. And the whole problem the Jewish leadership had is they were always looking at the second coming of Christ in the Old Testament and failed to see the first coming of Christ. So that's why Christ didn't mount to what they thought he should look like. He wasn't the warrior. He didn't come in and crush the Romans because that's his second coming. That's not his first coming. So there's more. Some commentators said, I haven't done this study myself, there's more end time prophecies in the Old Testament than there is in the New Testament. The other thing about these end time prophecies, Jesus himself uses it. He uses it in the Olivet Discourse when he met and when he was telling the small group what's going to happen with the end times. That's in actually Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's reference to the end times, and Jesus referenced Daniel in the end times. I'm not going to get in, that's a whole study by itself because it's actually two different prophecies that Jesus is prophesizing. And a lot of commentators will put them in as one, and they're really two. And so I don't want to go there right now. But one of the things we talked about earlier is chapter 9 contains the most astonishing prophecy about the arrival of the Messiah and the Gentile times, the church period. It's unbelievable when you look at how accurate and how all history lines up to support the accuracy of this prophecy. When we get into chapter 9, we'll spend quite a bit of time there. So go ahead. Yeah, if you look at really the prophecy in the panoramic view, we're in the church time. Lane, this gets back to your study, dispensationalism. It lines all up with God's plan for man. But we're in this time of what's called the church time. It's a dateless time in God's plan. We don't know how long it's going to be. It's been 2,000 years. But this is that period of gap we talk about before the rapture and before the tribulation period. So if you look at Daniel's writing, he wrote and he's prophesizing really from the current time all the way through the end times, this last half of what we're looking at when it comes to the panoramic view.
We're going to get started in the first 2 verses. We are going to try to do 4, but we'll see if we can get them all in. We'll see.
We'll be close.
So 1 Daniel 1, verses 1 and 2.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So why did God raise up Babylon? This is if you were listening to your history lesson at the beginning. Why did God raise up Babylon?
Yeah, remember, Babylon wasn't the power. It was Assyria.
And Egypt.
And Egypt. And Babylon comes into existence. And so that's why did he use Babylon?
Well, not why did
Because he was their enemy?
Well, if it goes back to what the reasons I gave you that this was occurring, it goes back to for 2 reasons. They had really strayed into idolatry. So that was one, and then the second one was the straying from permitting the Sabbath year for the rest of the land. So he raised up Babylon. Is it a punishment? Is it just to, it may be a punishment. It may, I don't know. And I know there's disagreements about how that would go. So I'm not going to go there, but it may have been a punishment for idolatry. It may have been to reclaim the 70 years and give the land the rest that he called them to give it. But he did raise up Babylon as a message or for reasons or as a consequence to the behavior of Judea.
Yeah, and the interesting thing here, and again, I say this delicately, Ezekiel and Jeremiah warned the kings that Nebuchadnezzar was an instrument of God. And we had one commentator, I'm not going that, said he expects to see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. When you look at him, the evil person he was evil, he was wicked, he was a bad dude. He really was, in every shape, fashion, form. But he was also a genius. He was also a brilliant architect, a brilliant statesman, a brilliant soldier, a brilliant leader. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the architecture that went on during the Babylonian Empire. It is amazing how smart and wise this man was. Though he was very, very evil, God raised him up for a purpose, and Israel was warned that this is God's instrument. Now, again, that's from commentators' view. I didn't think of it that way, but does God use evil people sometimes to do his work?
Well, Judas was.
Yeah, I know.
So,
So
Yeah.
it's hard to say, but the answer may be that's God's sovereign. He can use whoever he wants to do his work.
In almost every situation where Israel was disciplined, God used what we would consider an even more evil nation to discipline them. And then, of course, God turned around and disciplined the nation that disciplined Israel. But yeah, that's very common in Scripture or in Israel's history for God to use somebody we think of as really terrible to discipline them.
And the next question goes hand in hand with this, is that, God sent one angel and wiped out the Assyrian army. What was it, 170,000 people and one sword? So could God save Jerusalem? Yes. So how did Nebuchadnezzar take over Jerusalem? The scripture tells us. Look at the second verse here. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. God gave the king into his hands. He didn't win it. God gave him into his hands.
Dave,
So, yeah.
how many times in Old Testament scripture does it specify that God determined the outcome of battles and wars?
He always does.
a lot.
100%.
Every time. So you
Right.
see the sovereignty there.
Right. Absolutely.
The third question we have for this is, why did Nebuchadnezzar only take some of the temple treasures? This is kind of a trick question. I don't expect people would know this. There's a little bit of far-fetchedness by one person that I will go ahead and give you because we heard it. But they said that Judah, in realizing that they were going to be conquered, took many of their artifacts and hid them, the Ark of the Covenant being one, which they said somewhere was hidden in Ethiopia and should still be there today. And I don't know about that.
We won't go there.
But I'm not getting into that, whether some of them were taken and hidden, or whether he just picked things that he wanted, caught his eye, or what he could carry in this certain vessel, whatever. He took some of them, but why even take them? And the process, or the culture at the time, an army would go in, and if they captured articles from the temple of one god and could carry it to the temple of their god, and were successful in bringing these temple treasures to their god's temple, that it would prove their god was dominant or more powerful than the other god. So he took some of the temple treasures instead of all. I don't know why some were hidden, or he just decided he would take just a few because he took the big ones or the shiny ones, who knows. But why did he take them? He took them as just, it's kind of a flag of victory. These temple treasures are now at my God, which I think was Baal, B-A-L. They're at my God, and he is obviously more powerful because they're here and not there.
Right. And I think go ahead. But I think it's a technical issue that's brought out historically. But Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, technically in 1605, he was not king of Babylon. He was destined to be king. And I think it's using this terminology as a name for him because that's who he is. That's who he's recognized as. And so he's using this name. But his dad was a king. His dad got sick and was dying. Nebuchadnezzar left the siege of Jerusalem
605.
in 605 and went back to Babylon to take care of his dad and take over the kingdom. And so he really didn't have time to finish the job in Jerusalem because of his dad getting sick. But he technically didn't have the throne of the king yet. But we refer to him that way. And that's the way that it puts it out there. So I'm just making that note in case it comes
Well,
up.
you know, if Daniel wrote this, he didn't write it in 605.
Right.
He wrote
did.
it later on, and so it
He
could
would
be,
reference
he would
him.
reference him as who he was. I think
Exactly,
that makes sense to me.
All right, verses 3 through 4. Then the king instructed Aspenser, what's his name?
Ashpenaz.
Aspenaz. I can't say some of these
We
names.
practice them and practice them.
Aspenaz, the master of eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, and had the ability to serve the king's palace, in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. First, let's not get confused. Chaldeans and Babylonians are almost synonymous. They were called both, so don't get confused by that. This question in your handout was actually put into the wrong verses, but the first question comes up is, what is a eunuch?
Nobody wants to answer that one.
Well, let me give you a technical answer. Is eunuchs were brought in to serve a king, and most of them were physically made impotent. So they could not have children, and they served the king for lifetimes. We don't know whether Daniel was physically made impotent. He did serve the kings for a lifetime, and there's no reference of him ever being married or wife or children or descent, anything. So it's very possible, but it's also possible because it's a term used for a king's servant. And many times that's not someone who was made impotent. But look at the other side of this, we're going to get into this in just a minute, what's his tactics controlling Judea. But if they are made impotent, it kills the bloodline, right?
Mhm.
Bloodline's gone. So who did he bring in? He brought in descendants, king's descendants, some of the nobles, the young men, the one without, but he brought in the best of the crop, royalty people, all the descendants. And if they all became eunuchs and physically eunuchs, that would have destroyed a bloodline. It really would have.
Was there another meaning for eunuch?
I said, it's someone that serves the king, which may or may not be made.
Right. So,
Yeah, both ways.
So the next question is, what was Nebuchadnezzar's tactic in controlling Judea? So we know that he left Jehoiakim on the throne again as a puppet king, and he took their children. They probably took historic documents say probably somewhere between 50 and 75 teens were taken in the 605 captivity. And his tactic was that he took the noble children to keep the parents in line back in Judea. That was one. The second thing, he brought these boys in as young teens to teach them a new language, to teach them their culture, to teach them leadership. And through this process, being at their age, they were really likely to develop a loyalty to him for the way that he had given them and the way he had raised them, and in hopes, and we're going to see this really next week as he goes to trying to change even their names, but through this trying to indoctrinate them into Babylonian culture and distance themselves from the Jewish cultures.
Yeah, and this next question is really very similar to that question, is why take the best of the young men? It basically cuts the legs out of Jerusalem ever trying to raise up against him again. So it really, he took the best and the noble, the brightest people out of the culture that would give him an opportunity really to keep that culture up under his control. The other thing is, by training them in the Babylonian culture or the Chaldean culture, he would have someone that could bridge, that could communicate with that other nation. They knew the ways, they knew the culture of the other nations. Now they've been trained the language and the culture of this nation. So taking the best of these people who could be trained gives them good ambassadors that are loyal to him, but also have some loyalty back to who they're over. And so it is a very wise strategic move. This was not by accident. This is all planned by Nebuchadnezzar, and it was done frequently that he took over a nation. And that was in order to get complete control of the nation and then set up ambassadorship, a communication back and forth to that nation. And we mentioned these young men being Jews and being in a, call it a leadership role, even though they were servants, they were serving the king. And we call about serving the king. They served him in astrology, in plans, and what decisions to make, and what to do. I mean, this wasn't like serving food. These were the knowledge servers. These were the brains. It's like an executive hiring the best employees he can to make them successful. Nebuchadnezzar brought in the best and the brightest to make him successful. So that's who these were. And in that capacity, it showed the Jews that they had representation in government, even though they were in exile at that time period. So it's God's plan, as we mentioned earlier, to give them some comfort. Not all was lost. They had good people within the king's good grace.
So the last question, this isn't an answer, but what was the outcome of this captivity? I have a list of 5 things, and I thought these were really good. So going through this process, 5 things were accomplished. First, it took the Jews out of idolatry. Never again did they go back into worshiping all these pagan gods in addition to trying to worship just one god or turning their backs on him altogether. But it did turn them away from idolatry. The synagogues were born at this time, after this time. So the synagogues became a part of the Jewish heritage and life, day-to-day life. The Old Testament was canonized as part of this process. A godly remnant was prepared to carry the seed of the Messiah, and the message of God was spread to heathen nations. So through this captivity, even though, again, and we can look at our own lives, we're going through just such a bad time, and we just think God has forgotten about us, or isn't paying attention, or somehow wasn't in control. What happened to us? Frequently, he is in control, and can use what's going on in our lives that may not be pleasant for the greater good, and than we ever would have imagined.
Yeah, and what we get into really is these, when you look at Daniel, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that Daniel is compared to Noah and Job by Ezekiel. He's put in the same category as those 2 men. They're the only men in the Bible that have nothing bad spoke against them. So Daniel has nothing against him spoken bad against him at all. So he's in the unique of unique when it comes to men in the Bible that was referenced. Also, like Joseph was an executive and a leader high up in Pharaoh's court. Daniel is an executive and a leader that went through the Babylonian Empire and also made it to be the prime minister of the Persian Empire. So he spans 2 empires in leadership role. It's amazing to say that this guy was actually able to do that, to have that type of God support, because it had to come from God, and God used him for that. So what we will get into next week is we'll probably try to cover most of the rest of the first chapter. Again, I know it may be boring to some extent because this is history, but the first 6 chapters are history. That's how we label them as history. And it's important to get through the history before we get to the prophecy. But I think a lot of the fun part is when we get into prophecy. I can't wait for chapter 9. So with that, any last minute comments, any additions to or corrections to what we said? But we always welcome those.
Okay.
We silenced you.
Yes, darn good.
I love history. I get so excited about the history part of it. I didn't know I was a history nerd, but I guess I really am. And so I really love this part, but we hope that it works.
Right, there's so much more that we read and got into the detail here, that, there's actually two 70-year periods that run concurrent towards the end, but they're two different year periods. We're not gonna get into all that because it's speculation by one commentator and I haven't seen it anywhere else. But you can go down the bunny trails here and you could be into this for hours and hours and hours and come out with just a tidbit. It's just so amazing how so much of it is substantiated. And it's substantiated by documents outside of the Bible. It's mind blowing how integrated the Bible is. It really is. It's hard to believe.
Let's close in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this time to look at this book of Daniel. I pray that as we go through it, we know it is a pattern for our lives. So the important thing from us for the first 7 chapters is to learn a lifestyle that you want us to pattern our lives after, to have faith and devotion like Daniel did. So I just pray you speak to us as we continue on through this study. I pray, dear God, that you will be with us throughout the week and that you will touch our minds with bring to mind the members or the people on our prayer list, the events on our prayer list. I pray that you would be with those throughout the week. And I just pray that you would give us a desire and a burden to get into your word. I think that spending time in the word is probably one of our very most important things to do each and every day. We praise you, we thank you, we give you the glory in Jesus' name, amen.
One thing I failed to mention, and shame on me, is this book is also full of miracles. So it's a book full of miracles and a book full of prophecy. And so we'll get into both of those. So that's the other side of it. I think it's important. I apologize, I didn't get that in earlier, but we'll hit those miracles. And you've heard of them, a lot of them. Shadrach, Meshach, and all. You will going to get into all these things, which I think are so marvelous. All right.